Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Season 1, Episodes 18 through 20. So, reasonably, I was going to probably watch a little bit more of this, but I thought I was also going to cut my losses too, because when looking at it, I don't know, I had something kind of goofy going on with the Wi-Fi and stuff like that, so it's just kind of going a lot slower than I would normally like it to, but it is what it is, and ultimately I was able to get quasi some episodes before we ended up kind of going where we're going. So we are here to ultimately just talk about these episodes. Hopefully you'll enjoy whatever banter or whatever I have to say about these episodes. So going into here, we have it to where reasonably this is quite possibly, and if or finally, the end of the Oliver era within these episodes. Funny enough, how I kept complaining about the Oliver era, and now like we're seemingly going to be wrapping up that fairly soon within these episodes. So I actually did start to re-enjoy these episodes after the whole Oliver era thing was done, because ultimately it felt that it gave everybody else a story that doesn't have a story, with the exclusion of maybe Summer. Um, it kind of gave everybody something to do. The only problem that I didn't like in these episodes were ultimately that they went into Valentine's Day, how they basically have to really have Sandy mention how he hates it and how and all this and that and rigmarole. Kirsten evidently is a lover of Valentine's Day. Evidently, it's her favorite holiday, and so good for her. Me, I'm on Sandy's side. I love the holiday just because it um, does pretty much exactly what Sandy says in these episodes. So into this show, we have an escalation going of Ryan being suspended from school almost indefinitely, and reasonably, the thing that I had reasonably completely skipped out upon was the whole note thing that ultimately Oliver, I believe, was supposed to give to Oliver gave to Ryan to give to Marissa, and so, or it was something along those lines, where ultimately Marissa had a note that ultimately Oliver had, and ultimately Ryan had snuck in and read it, and ultimately the note had said that he had really been falling for her. He's never met anyone like her, and so on and so forth. In these episodes, we're going to finally figure out who the heck Natalie is, because reasonably, she really is a real boy, from what I remember, or in this case, a real girl. But the only problem is there is no actual real girl, if you know what I mean. Meaning, I'll have to talk about that in spoilers. Evidently, Natalie is real for realsies, but not in the real way of which that we would think. So, going into this, I thought that these episodes were fun, just because I like the fact that Sandy was consistently going to Ryan and it was like, how about we just talk? How about we just how about we just like really just you tell me what's going on with you, and ultimately Ryan is just like, I'm not saying anything, because no one really believed him. He's basically the boy that cried wolf so many times to really just say that there's something wrong with this kid, to the point where Ryan even has to go to his arch nemesis to ultimately try and solve this whole thing, and a one-time team up, I guess, when it comes down to it. But if anything, yeah, we have everybody finally getting a story, with the exclusion of really and truly Summer. It just kind of feels like Summer is kind of tagging along onto Seth's story, but eventually, towards the end of this story, we eventually have to have begrudgingly Summer something to do. Um, I would have liked to have seen what would have happened if Summer would have just consistently just downward spiraled into having absolutely nothing to do. Like, it's kind of funny how like Summer was even clinging on to like, hey Marissa, do we got anything to do together? And Marissa's like, hmm. So let's ultimately go into this review. It's 3 episodes, so we really have to kind of go into a lot of different people dealing with Valentine's Day in their own way, which, when really looking at it, I utterly am just like, you know what? Like, I'm a romantic at heart or whatever, but reasonably also, I kind of went into this whole Valentine's Day episodes consistently just going, ugh. Like there's too much love in the air, if you know what I mean. There's too much love in the air. Um, Especially dealing with supposedly Jimmy's quite possible secret admirer. So let's ultimately go into these episodes. Let's go and dust out that double five to otherwise count down what is to ultimately happen to probably mostly Ryan into these episodes, because again, like, he's more of the real focus, even though reasonably he has absolutely not much of anything to do in these episodes. So reasonably, we have it within the very first episode that we have it to where Sandy is going to Ryan and giving him a cup of coffee, and we're going into spoiler time now. So forgot to do that. So we have it to where Sandy is giving Ryan a cup of coffee and ultimately like asking, it's like, hey, if you want to talk about all this, we can talk. Because reasonably, Ryan has nothing but time. Basically, the only thing that he's doing with his time is basically just like doing sit-ups and push-ups and doing the equivalent of prison working out, because basically that's where Ryan is. Like, he is in prison and he knows full well about prison because he's been there. So ultimately, he's just staying at home and not leaving his bed, just because reasonably there's nothing else much else. There's not much else to do. We have it to where reasonably Sandy is punishing Ryan by saying, it's like, well, if anything, you're not going to go anywhere. You're not going to do anything or speak to anyone um, uh, until Sandy and Kirsten thinks it's okay. So we have it where Ryan just stays in his room and just does nothing. He doesn't even go out into the pool. He doesn't go and swim. Nothing. He just lays around in the pool house. So we have it to where Kirsten and Sandy are ultimately mentioning, it's like, man, like, we haven't seen him do anything all day. Like, are we being too harsh on him? And ultimately Sandy's like, no, we have to be firm. We have to, like, we can't actually ground him. We can't actually whatever, but because he's not biologically our son, but still, like, he ultimately is just kind of like, he needs to learn that we have to try to set some boundaries for him. So we have it to where ultimately in this episode we have realistically uh like some pre-Valentine's Day stuff going on. We ultimately have it to where seemingly that Seth is trying to get Summer into reading comic books, because really Summer has nothing better to do. Like, she's ultimately asking Marissa if they can hang out, and Marissa's like, well, no. Like, I'm going with Oliver and doing something, and ultimately uh, I'm going with my mom's for the weekend, and so on and so forth. And so Summer's like, oh, so, like, I have nowhere to go. And Marissa's like, sorry. So we have it to where we we have it to where Seth and Anna are thinking about going to the comic book store, and so overhearing that, Summer's like, "Well, hey, could I go?" And we have it to where it says Seth is like, "Really? Like that's interesting." So we have it to where ultimately Seth is giving, as per usual, Seth's Christmas presents, a starter pack. We have it to where Seth is giving Summer a comic book starter pack, ultimately telling her about the big key issues of comic books, The Dark Knight Returns, and The Watchmen, and all these really gritty comic books. And we ultimately have it to where they are kind of just sitting around together, just reading comic books. And we have it to where Seth is sitting so close to Summer, but then just kind of Anna is just sitting on the couch. Like it kind of feels, and it also kind of feels that Seth is ultimately um, being a little bit too much with Summer. So we end up having it to where Sandy walks in ultimately to kind of hear the conversation, see what's going on, and of course try to be a dad of sorts, because reasonably he can't be a father with Ryan, so he might as well be a father with Seth, his biological son. So we have it to where Sandy is walking in and ultimately seeing what is all going on. It seems that Anna is ultimately telling Seth that maybe Summer should get the kind of the lighthearted comic books, maybe like an Archie, or maybe like a Batgirl or something like that. Something more lighter than what Seth is recommending. And Sandy completely agrees, and ultimately he is kind of just seeing how Seth is being treated, to the point to where Seth is ultimately being put aside by Sandy, and ultimately saying like, "Hey, it seems like you're really like flirting with Summer and like leaving Anna in the cold. Like isn't Anna your girlfriend? And like ultimately you need to decide now," kind of thing. And so reasonably we have it to where eventually Seth and Summer and Anna are watching the Batman the animated series, and again there is that kind of cold shoulder that Seth is giving to Anna, and this and that, to where ultimately now Anna is ultimately going to give Seth the cold shoulder and is like, you know what, I'm kind of like sick of this. Because towards the end of this show, I will reveal why. So now let's get into what's kind of going on with everyone else. So Ryan, ultimately again, prison pool boy, is just doing sit-ups and whatever, and having a good time. We ultimately have toward Julie is kind of just like, she's a person that doesn't have much to do, so she's spending way overwhelmingly too much time in Caleb's uh, and Kirsten's business, just kind of going in there and reorchestrating everything, to the point to where ultimately Kirsten has nowhere to work, so she has to work from home because she doesn't literally have a desk. So we have it to where ultimately Sandy is trying to go and talk to Kirsten and stuff like that, because uh, it seems like they're talking about Ryan, and they're talking about Seth, and they're talking about everything that's going on. So while that is also going on, we have to where Julie is seemingly eventually like consistently like tying herself onto Kirsten. At some point they're going to Kirsten and Julie are going to go into business with one another, but that's a different time and a different story. So we have it to where Julie is ultimately going crazy on the decorations, to the point to where reasonably Caleb is turning to Kirsten, is like, okay, like Julie's spending way too much time like in my grill, in my face. Like you need to do something about that. To where Kirsten's like, "What do you mean? What? Like, do you want me to fire her?" And he's like, yeah." So we end up having Kirsten and Julie spending so much time together that Julie is over by the pool boy area, the land of the pool, the home of the brave, and so we ultimately have Ryan, who is finally taking uh, some time that is not out, and ultimately going and seeing Julie and saying like, you know what? I know we never see eye to eye because you're my arch nemesis. Let me get out the kryptonite. Um, but we have one thing and one thing only in common, Marissa. And ultimately, Oliver is spending way too much time with this girl named Marissa. And reasonably, like, this guy has done some awful things. Um, I think he has a girlfriend that doesn't really and truly exist. And ultimately, I think that this guy is damaged goods. Ultimately, slicing his wrist over some girl at some part of school. So Julie is ultimately going like, well, Ryan, I really do hate you, but I think I have to step in and be a mom. And if Ryan was a bad influence, then maybe also this Oliver kid is a bad influence as well. So, like, I like this kind of this one-time team up between Julie and Ryan. Man, basically is Ryan like making friends of all of his enemies, and it's awesome. So we have it to where now going on into here. I also am really enjoying the whole Luke moments within these episodes as well, because Luke basically takes it upon himself to ultimately uh, like he's talking to Seth, he's talking to Ryan, and ultimately he's trying to figure some things out. We ultimately have it to where Seth or to where Luke is ultimately trying to spend a little bit of time here and there with Marissa, just to kind of see like, well, if Ryan can't be there for Marissa, then Luke is going to try to be, because Luke didn't like Oliver either. So we have it to where ultimately Luke is going and talking to Seth, and he is ultimately going like, yeah, this Oliver guy, like, it seems like he wants Marissa like all to himself, because it seems like every single time that Marissa is on her phone, we have Oliver that is ultimately saying, it's like, oh, well, that's Ryan, isn't it? Like, it's Ryan, just let me know it's Ryan. And Marissa's like, hold on a second, I'm on the phone. We ultimately have it to where at some point that Ryan is going to try to talk to Marissa in this library, but she never shows. We ultimately have it to where Marissa ultimately is to get the phone call, and and uh, and it is Ryan, and ultimately she hangs up on him, and we have it to where Ryan leaves a message, and that message is ultimately to go to some library later on. We ultimately have it to where Ryan shows up at the library, and Oliver intercepts him to ultimately say, like, dude, like, you've lost. Like, you're donezo. Like, stop trying to get to Marissa. Like, it's not going to work. You've lost. Like, take your ball and go home kind of thing. And so we have it to where Ryan is ultimately consistently talking to Luke, and Luke is ultimately thinking, it's like, you know what? Like, what is up with this Natalie girl? Like, if anything, I know some people at the school that Oliver used to go to, and so maybe I can go and ask them at this school if ultimately they've ever heard of Natalie. So we have it to where Luke does some reconnaissance and ultimately comes back to ultimately tell Ryan that there was no Natalie at this school. Like, this girl is completely imaginary. So we have it to where Luke is admittedly like telling Ryan, it's like, dude, we have to tell Marissa the truth about this Natalie girl. And Ryan's like, well, she's never going to believe me. If anything, like I'm dead to her because we had broken up, and ultimately like she doesn't trust me anymore. And so Luke is going and getting on his high horse and just saying like, well, she's gonna trust me. We ultimately have it to where Luke calls up Marissa, and we have it to where again Oliver is ultimately thinking that it's Ryan or it's her mother, because we ultimately have it to where reasonably uh, Luke and or Luke. Marissa and Oliver end up just kind of skipping out on all things, skipping out on school, skipping out on their therapy sessions, skipping out on everything to ultimately just run off together, run off to Oliver's hotel. We ultimately have a tour. Julie was trying to get Marissa to come back home, but reasonably Marissa won't listen. We ultimately have it to where Ryan is trying to intercept Marissa and talk to her about Natalie not being a real person, but Marissa wouldn't listen. And so reasonably you have it toward Julie is also trying to intercept Marissa as well, but Marissa just runs off. So Luke eventually is to go in there and try to Luke is trying to go in there to talk to her. So Luke ultimately is to tell Marissa, hey, like Natalie isn't a real person. There is no Natalie at Pacific, or there never was. So we eventually have it to where Marissa is ultimately going down to speak to the people down at the office of the hotel, and coincidentally, the one person behind the desk ultimately has the name Natalie, ultimately has the name Bishop, and Marissa is like, "Oh my god, like this is the girl that Oliver has been making up this whole entire time." Basically, like Marissa's asking, it's like, well, have you ever been tied to the Oliver family? And so this and that. So we end up having it to where reasonably Marissa is to put the pieces together that ultimately Natalie isn't a real girl. And so we have to where Marissa goes up to the penthouse of Oliver. And here's the interesting thing. Speaking of penthouse, we ultimately have it to where Julie, like, it's kind of interesting to see where Julie's thought process is when she was talking to Ryan. How basically a guy that lives in a penthouse isn't as bad as a guy that lives off of a pool house kind of thing. And like, I thought that that line was so interestingly delivered. So it's like Julie only cares if her daughter is living the high life, and it doesn't matter if she's happy or not. So we ultimately have it, and hence why she ends up going with. Julie wanted to go with Luke. Julie wanted Marissa to go with Luke because reasonably, speaking of Julie and Luke, I'll talk about that later. Marissa wanted Julie to go to. Marissa wanted or blah, blah, blah. Julie wanted Marissa wanted it. Blah, blah, blah. Julie wanted Marissa to go with Luke because ultimately Luke is richer than Ryan is. There we go. Finally. Good God. So we have it to where Marissa has the information downloaded onto her brain noggin, and she really can trust Luke compared to Ryan, and hence why when this whole thing resolves, what happens with Ryan and Marissa. So we have it to where ultimately Natalie is confronting Oliver with that it's like, hey, there really is no Natalie, is there? There really isn't. Because Ryan was telling Marissa, like, hey, there is no real and true Natalie. Get him to show you a yearbook picture of her. I bet you he won't find one. So we end up having it to where Marissa is ultimately asking Oliver about Natalie, And this guy is ready to pop because ultimately this guy is consistently asking Marissa to basically not get any single person in his way. Ultimately asking at some point to escalate their relationship so far into absurdity that they're going to like have to just run off together, run off to Paris or somewhere else. We have it to where Marissa's like, oh well, Marissa or Paris sounds great, and so we have it to where reasonably Oliver is like, well, hey, like, how about we run off to Paris right now? And we have it to where Marissa is just like, well, no, like, because reasonably, like, we have to be back by Monday and this and that. And so Oliver is just like, well, like, but yeah, but I want to run away together. I don't want you to be tied to Luke or Ryan or Julie or anybody kind of thing. So we end up having it to where ultimately that when Marissa confronts Oliver with the invisible Natalie, that Oliver finally just snaps and starts smacking himself absurdly to where Marissa's like, oh, stop! No, don't do it! Don't smack yourself. So we ultimately have it to where Oliver is losing control even in front of Marissa, to the point to where eventually we have it to where Oliver is scrambling. As he goes and leaves, he comes back with a gun to ultimately hold Marissa here indefinitely. We have it to where ultimately Ryan is to call Marissa, or no, wait, Marissa is ultimately calling Ryan, and we reasonably have it to where like Ryan is because Oliver ends up leaving the room. Ryan ends up trying to scramble to call Marissa, and then Oliver makes it back into the room. So Marissa is ultimately trying to convey that there's a gun in the room with Oliver, and we have it to where Marissa eventually spills that ultimately that Oliver has a gun. We ultimately have it to where Ryan is going out to talk to Sandy and ultimately saying, hey, Sandy, I need to go to see Marissa because ultimately Marissa is in trouble. And Sandy's like, give me your keys. Give me your keys. Ultimately, we're to naturally assume that Ryan is going to go nowhere. But instead, we have to where Sandy instead is going and driving Ryan to this place to ultimately help him because ultimately there might be some legal battle that Sandy might need to kind of uncomplicate, let's just say. So we have to our Sandy and Ryan, the new dynamic duo of team up of sorts, ultimately going into the hotel, and reasonably we have it to where they are trying to make a phone call to the room. Nobody's answering. So we have it to where ultimately Ryan and Sandy are to go and speak to the head clerk. Of course, this head clerk person is Natalie Bishop. We ultimately have Ryan who is putting those pieces together, and we have it to where Natalie is ultimately saying, like, man, like, everybody's asking about Oliver's family. What's going on? So we ultimately have it to where Natalie and two security guards and Sandy and Ryan are making their way to this hotel room. Because ultimately Ryan is to tell these people that ultimately there's a guy with a gun in the room. What are you going to do? So we have them go and knock on the door, and so reasonably we have it to where Oliver is trying to placate that everything is fine. We have it to where Ryan is ultimately yelling out to Marissa, and we have it to where Marissa eventually says that don't come in here, he has a gun. And so eventually we have the security guards break in, and ultimately Ryan is talking Oliver down. Oliver has a gun to his head, and so we have this very interesting way of writing. We have Ryan who is mentioning that um, like Oliver is mentioning that he thinks everything for him is over now. That ultimately, uh, doing himself in will do Ryan a favor, and Ryan's like, "Well, why would you want to do that for me? You hate me." And we have it to where Ryan is ultimately kind of curving this whole conversation to just say, it's like, well, like if you do yourself in, uh, you're not hurting like you're hurting Marissa. You're not hurting yourself. You're hurting Marissa. It's like, if anything, like all these people are here for you right now, and ultimately just put the gun down, kind of thing. It's like, if anything, like we can talk about this and kind of work through this kind of thing. So we eventually have Oliver drop the gun, and so they swarm in and they take him and they arrest him. Uh, and we basically never see Oliver again. Yay! Nothing wrong with the actor, but it's just the fact that like I never, I hate this story, but like we're gonna just keep on going with schmucks that Marissa is going to land in on, because ultimately now we have started another story with Ryan that ultimately will get to some escalation at some point, because it always has to. So we have it where the Oliver situation is gone and over with. We really dodged a bullet out of that one for having it be a much more elongated story. And so now we have it to where ultimately we have Marissa ultimately noticing that Valentine's Day is coming up, and recently she hasn't been close enough to Ryan. So Marissa, at some points, is kind of laying it on thick. She ultimately thinks that she can go back to kissing Ryan, and Marissa goes into a kiss, and Ryan goes in for a hug. Ultimately, Ryan is kind of giving so many vibes of like yeah, you don't trust me now, so I don't trust you. If anything, man, I dodged a bullet for you, and like now you're only like clinging on to me because I'm the only one that's in the room, kind of thing. Like if ultimately Oliver was still here, you would choose Oliver over me, kind of thing. And so that's where Ryan is ultimately creating so much distance away from Marissa, just because it's like, well, like if I was really your man, you would be really have wanted me much more so than Oliver. But anyways, we have it to where Marissa is ultimately just desperately trying to get back with Ryan, and it's not going to work. We ultimately have it to where Ryan is to eventually get into where he is meeting Teresa. And because we have it to where they are putting together this Valentine's Day dating, dancing thing. And we ultimately have it to where Marissa is to bring up about this Valentine's Day dance thing. And we have it to where Ryan is just like, yeah, maybe we'll meet somebody there. Wouldn't that be interesting? Because we're not going to meet one another there. So we have it to where eventually Anna is to break up with Seth. And so we have it to where Seth is ultimately going to Summer and mentioning, like, well, I hear there's a dance and I hear there's a Valentine's Day. Hey, how about we do something together? We end up having it to where Summer is just like, well, like I'm not gonna be your rebound, kind of thing, and so ultimately she is just kind of, she's really wanting nothing of Seth, but when it all comes down to it, we have it to where Summer is throwing herself at Seth. They're sharing a bed together, and ultimately they are sharing themselves together. To ultimately we find out that reasonably that first time for Seth, and we were to assume more than the first time for Summer, that ultimately Seth would have thought that things would have gone so much more better just because Summer eventually is much more talented in the bedroom. But reasonably, I guess not, because we ultimately find out that Summer has also had her first time with being in the bedroom business. So funny enough, we eventually have it to where Kirsten and Sandy are having this debacle of Valentine's Day. We ultimately have Kirsten who is coming in arrows blazing and shooting everybody because she loves Valentine's Day, and we ultimately have it to where Sandy is ultimately saying like who created Valentine's Day? Well, a marketing team did. Hershey's did because ultimately they desperately wanted to sell uh, uh, cards and candies and lingerie. And Kirsten's like, well, you never bought me lingerie. We have it to where Sandy breaks down that Valentine's Day is for couples and that anybody who's alone during this Valentine's Day gets depressed and this and that. It's just a horrible holiday that ultimately is just a thing that Sandy hates. So we have it to where eventually later on, Kirsten and Sandy are just arguing about everything that is going on, and but they are arguing about themselves because we have to where Sandy has to forcibly do something for Caleb, and Caleb has a uncle or some kind of uncle in the family that ultimately had stumbled upon some kind of um, information that he should not have. And so Sandy having to run up the flagpole of forcibly protecting this uncle because of what Caleb wants ultimately makes Sandy just very angry or upset towards Kirsten. And so really they're having this argument about all of this stuff, how Sandy is having to protect uh, Kirsten's father, and how Kirsten is ultimately like upset about how things are kind of going with their family and between them and this and that, to the point where it doesn't really have any rational sense of what they're yelling about anymore. It even seems like Sandy had doubled back and said like, well, I'm working for your father. Like, he had said the same thing twice. So we have it to where Sandy is ultimately telling Kirsten, it's like, what are we even arguing about? And Kirsten's like, I don't even know, but it sounds serious. So we have it to where ultimately, we have to where Sandy, while the kids are at this dance, ultimately Sandy throws that line again about, like, I'm telling you guys again, never get married. And we have to where Sandy's to walk off. Um, just to remind the guys to never get married. So we have it to where ultimately Seth is to break down the fact that he is ultimately things are going well in the bedroom business with Summer, and so reasonably we have it to where Seth is just ultimately going like, you know what, I think I need to go and have a talk with my dad about about that kind of talk, about the bedroom talk. So at some point that happens later, but so we have it to where ultimately Ryan is to eventually see the prepping of this dance go on, and we have it to where Teresa is ultimately meeting Ryan and ultimately mentioning like she's catering for this party, and so he's like, oh great, well good for you. We ultimately find out that Teresa is ultimately engaged to a man named Eddie, and so it's like, oh okay, so this relationship is not going to work out. But then again, when looking at it, like basically, when has a relationship ever not worked out for Ryan in any sort of capacity? So we ultimately have it to where Teresa is ultimately seeing Ryan as a new puppy, or in these terms, a Snoopy, because he had played in a play before, and we have to keep harboring that. every single time that ultimately, like Seth had mentioned, that Ryan had been in a play at some point, and so they gotta kind of keep bringing it up to make Ryan just be aggravated about how they know about that. So. And ultimately, we have it to where Sandy had mentioned that, oh, hey, I had been in a play before. I'd been in Greece. So we have it to where ultimately Teresa is seemingly really wanting to talk to Ryan. It seems like they want to catch up, and like it seems like old times for them. But we have it to where Teresa is mentioning like that Ryan had left her to just her own devices, and ultimately left her to be with Eddie. And it seems like the Eddie and Teresa relationship, it seems like there is some dissension between those two. It seems like there is some kind of like it seems like Teresa is getting cold feet and running off from Eddie, and Eddie is ultimately trying to run off to find where Teresa had gone, kind of thing. So we find out within here that that Julie is eventually going and having her own relationship, as well as Jimmy is getting his own secret admirer. So we have it to where Julie is ultimately going to land Luke, because Luke ends up going and, and taking a little knock knock on Julie's home to ultimately mention that ultimately everybody around the school all wanted to give a little bedroom business to Julie, um, because everybody thought that they were uh, her favorite mom to want a wham bam thank you ma'am, I'm assuming. So we have it to where Julie is, because Luke tried to spend some time with Marissa, but Marissa never showed. But then Luke tried to comfort Julie, and it gets to where Marissa, or to where Julie is ultimately going and just like, you know what, F it. Like, I'm gonna have me and Luke just do some booty calling, because we have it to where Julie is ultimately um, getting a booty call by Caleb, and Julie's like, you know what? No, like I'm not just gonna be like whatever you need me to be, need me, and I'm not gonna just drop whatever I'm doing just to drop trial for you, if you know what I mean. So we have to where Caleb walks off and he's like, well, I guess this was a booty call. So, which I thought was a hilarious line. So Julie is ultimately landing her way into Luke's bedroom, if you know what I mean. And so we have to where Jimmy is getting some secret admirer cookies, and we have it to where Jimmy is like Marissa, you didn't have to do this. Marissa's like, I didn't do this. It's like, if anything, like it was somebody else. So Jimmy has to kind of figure out who exactly were these cookies, and so Jimmy ends up creatively going to Kirsten, and Kirsten ends up saying that it's like, oh, you know who would make these cookies? Haley would. And Jimmy's like, aha, I figured it out. So we have it to where Jimmy goes and tracks down Haley, and Haley appreciates that Jimmy had taken the time to track her down, ultimately for them to go to the lighthouse to go and have a meal together, and seemingly cementing that these two are going to eventually end up together. So at this dance, we ultimately have it to where Marissa is still just locked down on Ryan. She's ultimately trying to, as much as possible, like try to get with Ryan. Like she is just like ultimately just like, I will not leave here until I get some of that Ryan. And Ryan is ultimately just like, I'm not interested. I am definitely not interested. Whoops. I'm gonna have to pause here for a second. And we're back. So Marissa is ultimately just wanting to pretend with Ryan that they have never met before at this dance. And ultimately, she's like, can we just start over, kind of thing? And Ryan is just like, no. If anything, like, Ryan is so scarred from Marissa's distrust and basically how reasonably she kept running off into Oliver's hands. What's going to happen within the next time where Marissa's just going to be running into some other man's arms. We have it to where Ryan had stolen Marissa from Luke. So basically, now that Ryan had put so much of that effort in, it's like, well, when Marissa's just going to run off to some other man, then ultimately Ryan is just like, well, like if she's doing the exact same thing to me that I did with her and Luke, then like, you know what, this is just never going to happen. Like, and it also seemed too like there was so many several like complications with Ryan and Marissa to start with. There were so many times where every single time that they were trying to do something together, there was an interruption. There was some kind of so reasonably like Ryan and Marissa's relationship never really and truly got started because reasonably there were so many complications, there were so many issues, and reasonably they never really had a real a real solid foundation for this relationship anyways. So to eventually just call it quits was just as easy as just saying like, well, uh, we had a good time, but like that's all we had was just times. We had nothing that really uh, like kept this candle burning. Anyways, so we have it to where Ryan is just like, well, you don't trust me anymore, so ultimately, and you're just gonna land yourself into another bed with anybody that is gonna just want to keep you there. So I'm bouncing, I'm deucing, I'm out. We ultimately have it to where Ryan is only interested in Teresa, and so he leaves this party just to go and talk with Teresa and ultimately just do some catch up. So we eventually have it to where Ryan is talking to Sandy about like, you know what, I'm really interested in this Teresa girl much more so than Marissa right now. But the only problem is that she's engaged to some Eddie character, and Sandy's just like, well, like I guess it's just not meant to be kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Eddie is to eventually talk to Ryan and ultimately do some catch up because Eddie knows Ryan, but that's the only person that he knows around this place. It seems that Teresa is ultimately staying at some hotel somewhere, hence why Ryan is just kind of making his way to Teresa. So it seems that that is a fledgling relationship that is going to work out. We ultimately also have Seth, who is going and finding out that it seems that Summer. It seems like it seems that Seth is ultimately wanting to have some kind of relationship with Summer, but Summer is going off to go and kiss a million guys at some kissing booth by the school of all places. And because it's Valentine's Day and this one guy offered Summer like, yeah, you know what? Like, it seems like I'm a person that would kiss like a ton of women, and so Summer, I think you're that person too that's gonna kiss a lot of guys, and so we have it to where Seth is just kind of irritated that Summer just went and was fine with kissing all these women, or that Summer is fine kissing all these men. I mean, maybe it is women. I don't know. I didn't see everybody in the line. So we have it to where Seth is kind of angry and upset about Summer because ultimately they had spent plenty of bedroom business times in the bedroom, ultimately try to make this bedroom business work. But we ultimately have it to where Seth is kind of like boasting on how like I bet Summer can't wait to like get into the bed with me again. Ultimately, we have to where Seth is ultimately answering the phone with Summer to ultimately just talk, and we have to where Seth is ultimately mentioning to Ryan, it's like, oh yeah, I bet she wants to have phone sex or whatever. So funny enough, we had it to where, speaking of Seth and Summer, ultimately after that whole debacle of Oliver being over, I'm kind of tailing back to why Anna and Seth ultimately went south. So reasonably, Seth had to tell Summer that ultimately Marissa had Oliver troubles. Seth had to go and call Summer, and Anna was ultimately just like, "Why is it that immediately after, like, you hear some news, immediately you have to go to Summer?" And Seth is just like, "Well, like, but Summer is tied to Marissa, and like that's the only reason why I'm going and talking to him, and Summer doesn't know about this." And Anna's like, "You know what? Like, immediately everything that is on your mind is how could I do something with Summer? How could I be with Summer? How could I talk to Summer?" And so I'm gonna sum all of our relationship up to say adios, because it's like basically you're way too into this other girl to be anywhere into me, if you know what I mean. So immediately after Summer confesses his love for Summer, we have it where Seth goes out of his way to stand on top of a counter to ultimately confess his love to Summer. And ultimately, Seth is ultimately asking Summer to feel the same way too. Anna is there because ultimately we have it to where Anna is ultimately talking to Seth and Summer, and we have it to where Anna is talking to Summer, and I love this moment where Summer is mentioning that like there is no way that Summer is going to end up with Seth because she feels that ultimately she's not smart enough, or she's not geeky enough, or she's not something enough for Seth. So there's no way that eventually she's going to keep Seth because eventually he'll lose interest. And we have it to where Seth is getting some tutelage from Anna to tell for Anna to tell Seth, it's like, you know what, you have to confess your love to her because basically she is not willing to do public displays of affection with you. So you need to put on some public display to otherwise seal the deal that you guys are going to be together. And that's when Seth is like, okay, well, that's what I'm going to do. So he ends up buying a million kissing booth tickets to ultimately get it to where he can go onto the counter of where Summer is to ultimately confess his love to her and ultimately get her to go onto the counter as well to ultimately uh, like seal the deal that they are a real couple. Ultimately, you have a bunch of girls and guys that are all like, "Ah, isn't this nice?" And so reasonably, that's what kind of seals the deal for that relationship. And I think ultimately there are some things here that ultimately I probably forgot about. We ultimately have it where Kirsten and Sandy are going to. They had their huge argument, but eventually we have it to where even though Sandy hates Valentine's Day, we end up having Kirsten surprised with a giant box of chocolate and rose petals and all kinds of things to be super romantic. And Kirsten's like, "Oh, you did this for me," and Sandy's like, "Well, I have to keep Hershey's and Hallmark in business." So the ultimate avatar, Kirsten, is trying to grab onto some pieces of chocolate, and we have to where Sandy's ultimately like, yeah, I love the square ones. It has nuts. And so really, I think I've kind of resolved, I think, every portion of story within these 3 episodes, because I think really a bulk of it is really just either Valentine's Day, or a bulk of it is either just like people cementing their relationship. And even when I would consistently go through these episodes and just kind of go, ugh, too much love is in the air, too much. Everybody needs to find somebody in these episodes, and good for them because they're all getting stories then. But immediately I'm just consistently just going, ugh, like too much of this, too much love, too much is going on in here, and it just kind of makes me go ugh. Like it's just one of those where you kind of you kind of gotta go in here and roll your eyes a little bit just because of how just boy. But anyways, I thoroughly enjoyed these episodes, even though it doesn't have anything to much do with family. It has much more to do with couples and love being in the air, and ultimately Kirsten smacking people with bows and arrows. And we have to where eventually when Kirsten is to eventually get her chocolates, we have Sandy who is smacking her with an arrow, which I thought was funny. Kirsten was also like smacking Seth with a bow and arrow, and Seth was just like, ugh. So really within these episodes, I think that's all that I needed to go through. I think there's probably a huge probably amount of stuff that I'm skipping around about, but when looking at it, recently just everything was just really just tied to Valentine's Day, and so ultimately a ton of it was just ultimately like Sandy is ultimately still working on this case with Caleb's family member and to try to uncover some things. And we have it to where Sandy is ultimately getting under Caleb's skin, and we have it to where Caleb is ultimately telling Sandy, it's like, well, hey, you need to work this case and you need to be able to get this guy in the clear, because ultimately, like, any kind of issues or problems that um, Caleb has is going to backfire onto Kirsten, and that is going to affect Sandy, because ultimately Kirsten had signed the checks for her uncle and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, we're going to probably at some point like start to really uncover what is to go on with this whole case thing going on with Caleb and everything like that, and hopefully that is eventually going to conveniently all get resolved. But anyways, I think that's all that I'm going to say about these episodes. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.